At 2:17 a.m. on a Wednesday, a United States Navy submarine missed a scheduled communication window. That is not, by itself, unusual. What happened in the next 40 hours has never been officially explained. The Navy's silence was louder than any statement. Submarines miss windows. Equipment degrades. Atmospherics interfere. The protocols that govern how the Navy responds to a missed window are layered and deliberate, precisely because the worst-case interpretation, a boat on the bottom, is almost never what it turns out to be. Almost never. Hi, you're watching the Incident Brief, where we break down what you weren't supposed to see, right as they unfold. If you want to understand the decisions that shape these moments before anyone else, subscribe now and keep listening. The USS Vermont, a Virginia-class fast attack submarine, had been on patrol in the South China Sea for 22 days when it missed its 2:17 a.m. position check. The patrol area was a box of water, roughly 90 miles northeast of the Paracel Islands, shallow enough to be operationally uncomfortable, deep enough to disappear in. Vermont had been tasked with a collection mission, monitoring the acoustic signatures of planned submarine activity out of Yulin Naval Base on Hainan Island, where satellite imagery had shown a higher than normal sortie tempo for the preceding 3 weeks. Vermont knew what it was listening to, but what the crew didn't yet know, they too were being monitored. The passive sonar arrays that China has been installing on the seafloor of the South China Sea for the better part of a decade are not acknowledged in any official Chinese defense publication. Their existence is inferred from acoustic anomalies, from the behavior of planned surface vessels that seem to know too much about where they should be looking, and from a classified 2023 assessment whose existence was confirmed by a single congressional reference that was almost immediately stricken from the record. Signal degraded. Reacquisition pending. At 2:17 a.m., the Vermont was supposed to be there. Then it wasn't. The first missed window triggered a standard protocol response at Submarine Squadron 15's communications facility in Guam. A second transmission attempt was made at 2:49 a.m. No response. A third at 3:21. Nothing. By 4 a.m., the duty officer had escalated to the squadron commander, who escalated to Commander, Submarine Force Pacific, who elevated to INDOPACOM. By 4:30 a.m., a search posture was being quietly assembled, quietly being the operative word, because the visibility of the search was itself a problem. Every asset dispatched to look for the Vermont would be visible. P-8. A Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft flying search patterns are not invisible to Chinese radar. Surface ships repositioning toward a search box leave wakes that satellite imagery picks up within hours. The act of searching for the submarine would announce to anyone watching that the United States Navy had lost track of something it very much did not want to lose. And in the South China Sea, at a moment of heightened tension following the Iran strikes, China was watching everything, so the search had to appear as something else. What INDOPACOM ordered, beginning at 5:10 a.m., was a set of ship and aircraft movements that were deliberately framed within existing exercise parameters. A valiant shield rehearsal activity that had been scheduled for the region and provided a plausible cover pattern for assets, converging on the Vermont's last known position. 2P8 as were redirected from a scheduled patrol. The USS Benfold, an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, was tasked to alter course under the guise of an equipment trial. The movements were professionally disguised. They were not invisible. At 6:43 a.m., a Chinese Type 54, a frigate operating 60 miles to the southwest, altered its own course. A subtle correction that pointed its bow-mounted sonar array toward the area where the American ships were converging. Post-event analysis later flagged that course change as the first indicator that China had registered something anomalous. At the time, it looked like routine maneuvering. The thermal signature is inconsistent. The Benfold's watch officer logged the Chinese frigate's position and continued. Meanwhile, inside Vermont, the concern was strictly internal. At 1:58 a.m., 19 minutes before the missed window, the submarine's engineering officer of the watch had identified a slow leak in a ballast tank fitting that was rated non-critical by the automated monitoring system, but was, in the judgment of the officer standing in front of it with a flashlight, something that deserved immediate attention before it became critical. Vermont's commanding officer, a commander with 14 years of submarine experience, ordered the ship to come shallow for an internal inspection and to hold the communication window until the status was assessed. That assessment took longer than expected. A secondary seal was compromised. The repair required isolating a section of the forward ballast system. The procedure was standard. The timing was catastrophic. By the time the Vermont was ready to transmit, it had missed 3 windows. The Navy had mobilized a covert search, and a Chinese frigate had begun pointing its sonar in the wrong direction for the right reasons. The commanding officer transmitted a status report at 6:51 a.m. It was received at Guam at 6:53. The Vermont was not on the bottom. It was not being held. It had a compromised seal and a crew that was cold, behind schedule, and entirely unaware of what their silence had set in motion. Once Vermont reported in, the search effort ended quickly and discreetly. But on the Chinese side, the tension didn't subside. Because China had not been watching Vermont, China had been watching the search, and what it saw did not look like a submarine rescue operation. It looked like something else entirely. Movements of US assets northeast of the Paracel Islands matched past contingency plans that Chinese intelligence had tried to reconstruct. China possessed incomplete details from signals, intelligence, and an unconfirmed source. The fragments were wrong in their specifics but right in their geography. And at 7:15 a.m., as the American search assets were beginning their quiet withdrawal, a senior officer at the PLA Southern Theater Command Naval Headquarters briefed his commander that the United States appeared to be executing the opening phase of a contingency deployment. He was wrong, but he was not unreasonably wrong. What followed was a calibrated, deliberate Chinese military response built entirely on a false premise. 2 PLAN Type 055 destroyers sortied from Yulin. A J-16 maritime strike package was placed on alert at Lingshui Air Base. A Jing-class ballistic missile submarine tracked by acoustic data, later recovered from a US undersea array, departed its berth and proceeded to a patrol depth that put it within range of targets in Guam. None of this was publicized. None of it needed to be. It was the kind of movement that speaks through the sensors of the other side's surveillance systems in a language that requires no translation. INDOPACOM detected the Type 055 sortie at 8:02 a.m. The P-8As, still in the process of withdrawing, were redirected to track the Chinese surface group. The Benfold held position. What had been a search operation for a missing submarine was now, without anyone having made a decision to that effect, a standoff. At 8:30 a.m., INDOPACOM briefed the National Military Command Center. Vermont was safe, but the situation it had inadvertently created remained unresolved. The decision facing the Pacific Fleet that morning was one with no clear category in the established escalation management playbook. The United States had not done what China believed it had done. The correct move in theory was to communicate that clearly, to step back visibly, and to de-escalate the Chinese response before it reached a threshold from which return became progressively harder. The problem was the mechanism. The US-China military communication hotline established precisely for moments like this was answered by a duty officer who took the message and said he would pass it up. He did not connect the American caller to anyone with authority. The second call, 40 minutes later, reached a more senior officer who listened without comment and said the PLA's movements were routine exercises. They were not routine exercises. Both sides knew this. The third call, at 10:17 a.m., reached a general-grade officer who engaged substantively, but whose account framed the Chinese movements as a response to American provocation in the South China Sea, a framing that could not be conceded without implying that the original search operation had been an act of provocation. It had not been. But explaining what it actually was meant explaining that the United States had lost contact with a nuclear-powered submarine for 4 hours in Chinese claimed waters, a disclosure that carried its own set of consequences. Both sides were now trapped in a story that neither could fully tell. The standoff lasted until early afternoon. The Type 55S reached a position approximately 45 miles from Vermont's last known position and held. The J-16 package at Lingshui remained on alert. INDOPACOM positioned additional assets without announcing them. The Jing-class submarine continued its patrol. For 6 hours, the South China Sea held a configuration of forces that looked from either end like the prelude to something. What broke it was not diplomacy and not doctrine. It was a weather system. A tropical disturbance moving northwestward through the Philippine Sea degraded sea states across the northeastern portion of the search area and forced both the Chinese surface group and the American P-8 as to make operational adjustments that, incidentally, created separation between the converging forces. Acoustic data later picked up the P-land destroyers altering course to manage the sea state. The Virginia-Class submarine descended to a depth that put it outside its original patrol pattern. By 3:45 p.m., the configuration had dissolved. Not because either side decided to dissolve it, but because the ocean moved. The Vermont completed its emergency repair, resumed patrol, and returned to Guam 11 days later. The commanding officer's report described the ballast fitting failure, the repair procedure, and the missed communication windows. It was a maintenance report. It contained no reference to anything that happened above the surface while his crew was fixing a seal. He was not briefed on the full scope of what occurred until after his return. The Chinese movements were logged by INDOPACOM as an elevated readiness activity in the after-action summary. No formal protest was filed, no public statement was made. The communication hotline exchanges were summarized in a classified annex that has not been released. The Virginia-Class submarine's patrol track reconstructed from acoustic array data showed it reaching a firing position relative to Guam at approximately 11:40 a.m. How long it held that position before diverting is information that has not appeared in any public document. The undersea array data that contains that answer is classified at a level that ensures it will not be declassified within the careers of anyone currently serving. The 40 hours that began with a missed communication window and ended with a tropical disturbance moving forces apart are not in the public record in any meaningful form. What they illustrate is a failure mode that both the United States and China have studied, wargamed, and built communication architecture specifically to manage, and which, on a Wednesday morning in the South China Sea, assembled itself out of a leaking seal and a search pattern and a fragment of stolen intelligence that was right about the geography and wrong about everything else. Vermont is still in service. The undersea arrays that China has built into the South China Sea floor are still there. The acoustic intelligence China collected during 40 hours of American search activity, the precise movements, the timing, the asset signatures of how the US Navy responds when it loses a submarine, that data did not evaporate when the standoff ended. Somewhere in a server room in Hainan, those 40 hours are a training data set. For the next time it happens, the Vermont crew came home. The thing they left behind is less easy to account for.